Welcome to Human-Machine Relations. This is the podcast that explores how people and technology are shaping the future of work, creativity, and communication. Today, we're joined by Daren Roett, an independent consultant specializing in safety, leadership, organizational culture, and psychological safety. You might ask, what has psychological safety got to do with this podcast that talks about technology and its impacts on the way we work? You might even think this is a bit of a soft or a woolly topic, but actually, psychology plays a huge part in organizational culture and how people perform and behave towards each other at work. Daren's going to chat to us today about how creating a sense of safety is essential when implementing disruptive new technologies such as AI. With more than 28 years of experience working across global organizations, Daren's developed a deep understanding of the relationship between leadership behavior, employee engagement, well-being, and performance. In this episode, we're going to explore what psychological safety really means, why that's so important during periods of uncertainty and change, and how leaders can support their teams through major transformations such as AI adoption while maintaining a human-centered approach. Welcome, Daren.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ajira. Thank you for inviting me, joining you today. I'm really
pleasure to have you.
Excited to have this discussion with you.
Great. So you've spent much of your career working in health and safety, but increasingly your focus has shifted towards psychological safety. What led you towards this shift and to realize safety isn't just about physical risk, but also about how people feel at work?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, it's been over the near 30 years is that a realization that a lot of organizations are great at the physical safety. So, the context of risk in their workplaces, for example, and then there's been in a systems kind of approach. And then beyond that, there's been a shift into what they call then psychosocial risk. That's then looking at how people play out at work in terms of how they feel, how things are organized around them. Are the right adjustments, etc. there? And then there's another shift to say, well, what happens if people are feeling something but don't start talking about it, don't share it? And that's where psychological safety comes in. And for me, the important factor that I picked up over the years is that unless you get close to teams and start talking with them and really understand what's in their mind, in their mind, what they bring into the workplace, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, really the physical safety itself can be an increased risk factor because there's distraction elements at those kind of points, and people are human, right? Every day is different. They bring in don't necessarily unpack everything, right? What's happening in their home life. You can't leave everything at the door. It's not like putting a switch on, for example.
The term psychological safety is relatively common today, but I suspect that many people still misunderstand it or even dismiss it. How do you explain psychological safety in simple terms to leaders who might be encountering this concept for the first time? Why should they take it seriously?
Yeah, I think there's always been this challenge, certainly the last, I would say, 10 years plus, that is it really tangible, right? So we talked about physical safety, it's tangible, right? So if there's a physical risk in a workplace, it's a condition that could bring harm to someone. It's something obvious maybe in a workplace such as, a slip, trip or fall risk, or an overhead structure that's unsafe, for example. That's clear and fairly relevant and fairly easy to think about what do we do to action that. But I think from the context of what psychological safety is, it's something that's already there. It may be a low state, medium or high state. And leaders in the concept of this is to understand, actually, it's about what do we provide in terms of part of the culture, but as leaders, how do we set the tone? So an example of this, I would say, is that do people, for example, feel safe to speak up, right? Do they feel safe to actually ask questions, to even challenge the norms, assumptions, and even do things like admit mistakes, right? And that in itself, if you're creating an environment where people can openly talk, and that's what it's about communication primarily, be themselves, be consistent, and that's what it's really the crux of what psychological safety is. So when people talk about a psychologically safe state, that state shifts. One example of that, I'll give another point on this just very briefly, is that when pressure comes in, leaders will sometimes change tactic as well. And that's an interesting point. And then that really kind of test the measure of what the state of psychological safety is. Is it consistent? Does it move, with behaviors, for example?
And how do you go about actually measuring or assessing the psychological safety state?
Yeah, well, you know what? One of the simplistic tools I say to organizations is talk to your team. For many years in safety management systems is a big element to say you must consult, you must talk, you must communicate. Many organizations are not good at it. What they fail to do is speak to the teams. It could be, in groups. Typically, what I say to organizations, think about, when you're looking at launching a change or there's a progress in the business, what you should be looking at is, okay, what impact does this bring to our team? How would we find that out? Go and consult with them, talk to them, and that consultation could be formal, it could be informal, it could be that day-to-day pulse of discussion as leaders you have to get a feel what's happening in the business, or it could be something more, I say more formalized. Actually, yeah, we're looking at maybe a project or a change, etc. Let's get a group together, let's consult. And I think that's the critical thing, is communication, and part of that is consultation.
Is there a framework to put that around? Like, how do you measure, like, what's
Yeah,
low, what's medium, what's high?
Yeah, exactly. So surveys, you can use surveys. Some organizations are fairly good. They may have pre-existing surveys, and these are kind of annual or biannual surveys and pulse surveys, questions like, how do you feel about leadership? Do you feel supported? Do you feel that actually you're able to openly communicate? And some question sets are really good. And clearly, and the interesting thing about surveys, I would say, is that one thing I say to organizations is that look at your rate of take up of your standard surveys for a start. If you've got a low rate of take up, there's a fairly clear indication that perhaps your psychologically safe state's not so good, not as high as you would expect. Let's say, I don't know, on average, you've got a 25%, take up of surveys, even anonymous surveys. That's pretty low, right? And I know organizations average around 60, some of them upwards towards 80%. So they've got this kind of, collaboration's much better, stronger.
Yeah, it can be a sign of like a canary in the coal mine, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And in my last podcast interview, I interviewed my guest, Advita Patel, who's an internal comms expert. And she told me that one of the most common reactions she encounters with employees reacting to AI adoption is fear. When organizations are introducing significant changes, whether that's AI automation or even restructuring, why do people so often experience that sense of threat?
You think if you distill it down to, I guess, the basic human element, most of us don't like change. Okay, let's in the most simplistic terms, I would say, for example, let's say an office environment, and someone has an office desk setup. Someone changes the setting on their chair. All right, something simple as that. Who's done that? Who's changed that? I don't like the feel of that. It's not the right height. People know. And I think when we come into that more significant aspect of fear, it's fear of the unknown. It's fear that I've not been spoken to. I've not had the voice. I've not been, that back to that consultation piece. And I think it's then understanding that actually people are not fragile, but people do have, needs and demands. Everyone's different, right? So, you can have a bunch of workers all in the same role, all doing maybe the same job, the same training. But in terms of expectation, outputs, and needs and demands, they're all different. And that's where fear comes from. It's the unknown, essentially.
Yeah, and ultimately with a thing like AI, it's comes down to the fear that, oh, I'm going to be made redundant. My job is going to be at risk, or this is going to reveal. I think maybe people have this kind of, I don't know if it's imposter syndrome, or like a fear that I'm going to be shown up that I don't know as much, or something else out there is cleverer than me, or someone else is cleverer than me. Everybody has that kind of fear in them.
Yeah, and I think it's how does an organization help their team embrace change, right? So if you think about adoption of something new, it's what's the value it's going to bring, right, to the individual, okay? And I think, many people that I speak to, right, and it's often they say that wind of change, oh, something's coming, it's really fearful, right, as you say. And then it's like, wow, okay, it's going to help me accelerate what I do. It's going to showcase and actually release my other skill sets maybe, right? And it's actually then, it's about leadership actually opening and unlocking that potential for their teams to realize that actually, guys, there's benefits. We're going to be able to do something positive with you, for you, alongside you. Yeah, and that's key, right? And it's back to that. Don't hold it close in a closet almost as leadership. Say, oh, well, we'll show and tell right at the very end. It's actually right from the very outset, right, of bringing your team in.
Yeah, and so I mean that leads me very nicely into my next question. So if you were, as an organization, preparing to implement an AI technology or platform, what would a psychologically safe approach to change management like that look in practice? And what should leaders be doing from day one?
Yeah, absolutely. From day one, okay, in that, even in the early thinking phase, it's like one of the first things is you're thinking, who do we bring in? Who do we work with? What teams need to know? And more important, not need to know, but also what can they contribute, right, to this change? Because if they're bringing in the technology and AI adoption, etc., it's about, okay, if it's going to land with our team alongside them, push forward what we're doing as an organization, as a business, clearly it's about our people front and center in this. And it should be, right? It's not just about the adoption. The adoption is individual and people adoption as well. That's got to be almost front and center, I would suggest, for any organization. So that clarity of, okay, who needs to be involved, who, what, when kind of scenario, if you look at it in its basic terms, and then looking at it from the point of view, okay, how can they contribute? What is it that actually they've given to us that makes us think, actually, we need to shape this differently? We can't just say one and done kind of scenario, right? And I think that's critical as well. It's that if you don't get buy-in, that's going to be so hard to deliver. I've seen it fail.
Yeah, definitely. And at times like this, you'll see many leaders unintentionally sort of respond to this sense of uncertainty or rising levels of fear by actually increasing control and tightening their decision making, and sort of say, right, I'm just going to make a decision, and everybody has to deal with that. So, I mean, that hinders psychological safety during these times, doesn't it? What kind of leadership behaviors are more effective? What should they be doing instead?
It's that, it's almost back to those, in many ways, I guess, the strong, almost, atypical, traditional quality leadership traits like empathy, openness, transparency, willingness to actually, almost loosen up as opposed to, tighten it, to say, okay, I don't know, and in that course of action, say as a leader, I don't have all the answers. Be open about that. I need your help, team. Your inputs are valuable, and they're actually beyond value, critical. And I think it's got to be the opposite. It's got to be that polar opposite, because if you don't, it's back to that buy-in piece. You may think you've got the greatest value and measure, something new is going to be pushed through in the organization. And that's that word. If you're just pushing it through without that buy-in, I'm not saying it's going to fail, but it's going to be a hard slog. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, some change management models, like for example, ADKAR. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. It's sort of like that allows that kind of consultation piece where employees who actually doing the work, they're in the trenches, they know what problems they face and what they need to do their jobs properly. That allows them to contribute solutions and also understand what the challenges are, right? So approaching it in that way could be a useful.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also understanding that actually there may be this kind of wind of everything's going to be great, it's going to change everything for the better. But also in that discussion piece with teams, you've got to understand that they may give some really strong insights. Actually, this is going to complicate some aspects of our work, make things more difficult for us. It's going to slow us. And having that discussion openness is actually, okay, now we understand. Actually, we do need to tweak and whatever in the elements we're thinking about. And I think that's imperative as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, because often leaders just they don't really know the reality of what it means to do that specific role or job, and what the things are, the actual workflow, and the challenges that person faces. Yeah. And when it comes to having that dialogue and opening up that dialogue, it's if you don't have it, then it's much more difficult to say things like I need help, or I disagree, or even I made a mistake in certain certain cultures, organizational cultures that demand high performance all of the time. It might be such a taboo to say I made a mistake, and instead you might have a culture of blaming other people,
Yeah.
and so that can be really difficult to have those conversations even in a stable environment. And then you have a situation where AI and job security are already like causing anxiety. So I mean, how do you fix it when it's gone so far that it's almost sort of like a toxic workplace? That must be really difficult, right?
Yeah, that's right. You think about, okay, that high performance teams, right? There's different elements of high performance teams. Now, if a high performance team and a culture is people are always on, always like, it's almost like, yeah, 12, 12, 14, 16-hour days, if you're putting that time in, yeah, you're a high performance team member, you know, and realistically, we know that as you say, back almost that toxicity of a culture of burnout and fatigue, etc., can face many people. They can go for so long. We're only human, we're not machines. We're talking about machines here and human interface, right? As humans, we can only go so far and so long, right? We can do a great job to a point, but I think the reality is that back to that point around high performance, the really true high performance teams in a psychologically safe state of the culture are the ones that actually recognize when we need to go slow, recognize call out time, recognize that this is as a team to support one another, as a leader to recognize that actually within my team there's strengths, there's weaknesses, there's team members that that have a variable. Think about work-life balance as a great example, right? So many organizations talk about it but never really behind it. The ones that talk about it the most are the ones that typically are not so good about it, if that makes sense, in terms of its delivery and support. And I found that over the years, and I think from this perspective of high performance teams, you think about, let's say, teams as in sports, for example, right? The high performance teams know the importance of rest and recovery in sports. Absolutely
Correct.
Critical to be at your best. In business, do we really do that? Do you really see that? Often not. It's absent. High performance is you're always on.
Yeah.
Right?
And I come from an agency background, and I find that they often talk about work-life balance only to attract new hires.
Yeah.
But the reality is often very different, and you end up working very, very long hours. Clients want you to join calls all times of the day because they're in different areas of the world, and you end up just always, like you say, always being on, and it's exhausting mentally.
Yeah. And I think organizations back to that tapping into psychological safety, if people do not feel confident speaking up, taking those interpersonal risks within a team, that's key, right, as part of this, then there's that we hear about, quiet quitting, for example, right? Why do people leave? Why do people go absent for long periods of time? All these kind of scenarios, it builds into that. You think about that change. Organizations talk about transformation. If that change is not handled well, supporting its team as a caring environment, then there's going to be real big elements of failure. Absolutely.
Yeah. And looking ahead, technology is only going to accelerate the pace of change that we're seeing at the moment. What advice would you give to leaders who want to build resilient, adaptable teams without sacrificing the trust, the well-being, and the human connection along the way?
Yeah, I think they got to tune into more closely the fact that their teams are humans, right? And themselves as leaders be human. Be the person as a leader that recognizes that actually we can't always be at that rate of performance, that high performance, which is in a, as you say, more almost toward that toxic sort of cycle. And then actually facilitating environment, back to that point around as a team and as a leader, I recognize that you've got differing needs. I recognize that every voice counts. I know it sounds aligned, but every voice does count. The quiet ones are the ones that are going to bring in the closest, often I find, organizers, which they fail to do, right? There's also an assumption that the leaders, if they're quiet, then it doesn't take my time up. I'll let them get on with it. They may be quiet for a very good reason. It may be a very strong reason, which is either positive in a way, perhaps very minimal, but more often not so negative, because they're not happy for various aspects. They don't feel confident about that speaking up. They feel that their voice has maybe been shut down previously. They've been shut down once. Many employees have been shut down once. They often don't raise their voice again. I think, punitive environments, many leaders don't realize that actually their actions and their tempo and their voice and the words they use are very strong, right? And particularly when they're under pressure. And that's very interesting how that changes as well. They don't realize that actually what they are actually producing is a psychologically unsafe state. And it eventually, in the worst case scenario, back to what you mentioned, is that toxicity, that toxic, working state environment.
Finally, if there was one thing that you'd like every leader implementing AI to understand fundamentally about human behavior, motivation, and psychological safety, what would it be?
I think one thing is to take the time. I think many people are in this always-on environment. Leaders are the worst ones that I found often for it. Not everyone, some great leaders I come across, I work with, but I think take the time to be able to enable those slower discussions with your teams. I think, when we talk, when I say organizations are one-to-ones, it's, oh yes, I have a one-to-one scheduled, every 3 months, every year, no, I'm talking about the everyday discussions, right? Having that time with your team. Many leaders will say, I don't have the time to create it, because your team, your team is in effect, a reflection of you as a leader, right? We all know this. Okay, a good leader has a great team behind them. Okay, you can't be a great leader if you've got a poor team behind you. It doesn't work. It's not a natural state, and it won't sustain itself. I think importantly, it's about, I would say that it's creating the time, understanding, having honest, truthful discussions with your team, being the empathy is important, being empathetic, understanding points of view, understanding that everyone has differing needs. Because psychological safety, getting there is not about having softly discussions. It can be having very difficult discussions to move ahead, get beyond barriers and pain points and issues. And that's another thing as well. I think leaders need to understand, it can be painful. Don't be dismissive or try to, kind of almost dodge the bullet, should we say. And I think that a learning point for me is take the time, put your head up, recognize your team, connect with them. That's key.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Human Machine Relations. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us and for listening. A huge thank you, Daren, for sharing your insights on psychological safety. As we've heard today, creating a workplace where people feel safe to speak up, ask questions, challenge assumptions, and learn from their mistakes is essential for engagement, innovation, and long-term performance. As organizations continue to adopt AI and other transformative technologies, the real challenge may not be the technology itself, but how we as communications professionals, leaders, and managers help to support people through this uncertainty that change can bring. If you enjoyed this and you want to hear more, make sure that you follow Human Machine Relations on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thanks for listening. And remember, the future isn't just about what machines can do, it's about how we choose to work with them. Thank you. Bye.